The 26th of December 1943. The Arctic night is absolute dot in the black waters north of Norway. A lone shape cuts through the winter storm. Scharnhorst, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, drives her bow into mountains of freezing spray, each wave exploding against her hull like stone. The wind screams across her decks. Ice clings to railings, turrets, rigging. Visibility is measured in meters, not miles. Only darkness, snow, and the endless roar of the Barents Sea. Deep inside the ship, men brace themselves against the shaking steel. Boiler rooms roar. Ammunition hoists rattle. Orders echo through cold passageways. They know little only that a convoy is somewhere out here, hidden by the storm, and that the enemy is searching too far beyond the blizzard curtain. Another ship waits. HMS Duke of York. Her radar screens glow pale green in the gloom. Operators track a faint moving Echo 1 that grows stronger with every passing minute. Gun crews stand ready in silence, hands on breeches, eyes fixed on the dark horizon they cannot see. 2 warships. 2 doctrines. 2 destinies set on a collision course in the frozen night. And within minutes, a single radar bearing will ignite the final battle of Scharnhorst. In the winter of 1943. The war in Europe was balanced on a knife edge. Germany was bleeding on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht pushed back toward its own borders. And the Soviet Union depended heavily on supplies arriving from the West. Weapons, tanks, trucks, aviation fuel. Food. Thousands of tons of material each week traveled along one of the most dangerous lifelines of the entire war. The Arctic convoy route. It was a corridor carved through ice, darkness, and storms. A route hugging the top of the world. The convoys, labeled JW toward Russia and RA on the return, sailed from Britain through the Norwegian Sea to Murmansk and Archangel. The journey was short but murderous. Gale force winds, waves like cliffs, temperatures capable of freezing a man's lungs in minutes. And all of it under the shadow of German bases in occupied Norway. For Germany, these convoys represented more than ships. They were arteries feeding the Soviet armies now advancing westward. Cutting this route meant starving the Red Army of fuel and ammunition. For the Kriegsmarine, it meant a chance to shift momentum at a time when almost everything else seemed to be slipping away. Since 1941, the greatest threats to the convoys had been the German surface raiders, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau. These were not just ships, they were symbols, floating fortresses capable of tearing apart merchant columns in hours. Even the mere possibility of a sortie could scatter entire convoys, just as it had during the disaster of PQ-17, when the fear of surface attack led to catastrophic losses. But by late 1943, the German surface fleet had dwindled. Tirpitz lay heavily damaged in a fjord after British-made submarines struck her in September. Gneisenau was out of action, stripped down, her reconstruction abandoned. Only Scharnhorst remained operational, fast, experienced, and feared. She had earned her reputation. In 1940, she and her sister ship had sunk the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. She had outrun British battleships, raided Atlantic supply lanes, and proven she could survive punishment that would cripple lesser ships. Few Allied commanders underestimated her. And yet in 1943, she was also a ship trapped by circumstance. Allied air superiority kept her pinned in Norwegian fjords for long stretches. Fuel was scarce. Every sortie risked detection. Every movement depended on the weather turning in her favor. Meanwhile, the Allies were adapting. Britain's home fleet, commanded by Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, had learned the hard lessons of Arctic warfare. Instead of waiting defensively around convoys, Fraser planned to use them as bait-setting traps, directing cruisers and battleships to crush any German surface ship that dared to strike. To Fraser, Scharnhorst was the final major obstacle to securing the northern convoys for the rest of the war. Her destruction would free Allied ships, release pressure on northern routes, and weaken Germany's presence in Norway. Throughout late 1943, both sides prepared for an inevitable showdown. The Kriegsmarine worked to strengthen radar, reorganize destroyer escorts, and find a window where Scharnhorst could slip into the Arctic undetected. They watched the convoys, studied weather reports, and waited for the exact conditions in which their lone capital ship might outmaneuver British patrols. The British, in turn, refined their Arctic strategy. More escorts, better radar, cruiser screens positioned like silent blades around the convoy columns. The stage was set slowly, quietly, through weeks of storms and coded signals. Weather worsened. Nights grew longer until daylight shrank to only a few hours of dim Arctic twilight. Ice crept along hulls and covered gunhouses. The Barents Sea became a frozen battlefield before a shot was ever fired. By mid-December, a decisive moment approached. Convoy JW-55B was ready to sail for the Soviet Union. Its deck load stacked with winter-coated vehicles and ammunition crates glazed with frost. At the same time, the returning convoy AF-55 steamed westward. The home fleet positioned its warships to protect both and allure Scharnhorst into a crossfire from which she could not escape, while sailors chipped ice from rails and secured frozen lines. Intelligence officers on both sides reviewed reports, sightings, and intercepted transmissions. Something was building in the north. A major clash felt inevitable, and in Norway's deep, narrow fjords, Scharnhorst's boilers were being warmed. Her crew prepared for sea. Her commander, Rear Admiral Erik Bay, received orders that would define the ship's final chapter. The Arctic convoys were on the move. The trap was tightening, and the last great German surface raider, still left afloat, was about to head straight toward it. In the final days of December 1943, the situation inside occupied Norway grew tense. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, faced a strategic reality he could no longer ignore. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Red Army's momentum was sustained partly by Western aid arriving through the Arctic convoys. If Germany was to slow the Soviet advance, even briefly, the convoys had to be struck. And for that task, only one ship remained capable of delivering a decisive blow. Scharnhorst. The battleship lay at anchor in Altenfjord, her dark hull blending with the frozen cliffs surrounding her. Crews had spent weeks repairing storm damage, testing boilers, and calibrating equipment in the bitter cold. Though powerful, the ship was no longer at her peak. Her radar systems, while functional, lagged behind British capabilities. Her destroyer escort was limited 5 ships, each strained by fuel shortages and Arctic wear. Yet the order Dönitz sent down was unmistakable: Operation Ostfront. A Christmas attack against convoy JW-55B. Rear Admiral Erik Bay, commanding from Scharnhorst, understood the stakes. He was an experienced destroyer officer, brilliant with torpedoes, aggressive by instinct, but now in charge of a lone capital ship against an enemy skilled in night fighting and radar warfare. Still, the orders were direct: locate the convoy, destroy it, and return before British forces could respond. But the British were already waiting. Admiral Bruce Fraser, commander of the home fleet, had anticipated a German sortie. The timing of JW-55B was deliberate, placed to tempt Scharnhorst out of hiding. Fraser formed a plan that required patience, positioning, and trust in his cruiser screen. Forward of the convoy sailed Force 1-3 cruisers under Rear Admiral Robert Burnett, HMS Belfast, Miss Norfolk, HMS Sheffield. These ships were the shield. Radar-equipped, swift, ready to shadow any threat. Behind them, concealed in the gathering Arctic storms, Fraser positioned Force 2, his hammer, the battleship HMS Duke of York, the cruiser HMS Jamaica, and a ring of destroyers including Savage Saumarez, Scorpion, and the Norwegian Stord. Each destroyer carried torpedoes, the decisive weapon of close-range night battles. Each ship was warmed, armed, and prepared for the coldest engagement of the war. On Christmas morning, the sea heaved with slate-gray waves as convoy JW-55B pushed east. Merchant ships groaned in the swells, coated in ice so thick it had to be shattered with axes. Escorts scanned the darkness constantly, listening to the hiss of wind and static on their radar sets far to the south. Deep inside Altenfjord, Scharnhorst's crew prepared to cast off. Before dawn on the 25th of December, Bay assembled his captains aboard his flagship. Weather reports showed heavy seas, snow squalls, and near-total darkness conditions he hoped would conceal his movement and hinder British reconnaissance. Luftwaffe aircraft were grounded. U-boats were scattered. Yet Bay believed the storm could also favor him. In the Arctic winter, chaos was often a weapon. At first light, or what passed for it, Scharnhorst slipped her moorings. Escorting her were 5 destroyers of the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, Z-29, Z-30, Z-33, Z-34, and Z-38. They accelerated into the Norwegian Sea, bows crashing through the storm. Snow swallowed visibility. The fleet vanished almost instantly from watchers on shore. But if Bay hoped for surprise, Fraser hoped for inevitability. British intelligence had tracked German movements for weeks. Patrol aircraft had spotted increased fueling operations in Altenfjord. Signals intercepts hinted at a major sortie. And so Fraser held his position north of the expected approach routes, waiting not to defend the convoy but to spring the trap. As Scharnhorst cleared the fjords, she entered a world of shifting shadows and violent seas. The destroyers struggled to maintain formation. Icing slowed their turrets. Radar screens flickered in the storm. Communication was patchy, every message distorted by weather and equipment strain. Yet Bay pressed on, unaware that British cruisers were already spreading out before him like a set of invisible walls. By late afternoon on Christmas Day, while crews on both sides ate cold meals in steel compartments, the two fleets unknowingly closed the distance. JW-55B continued eastward. Burnett's cruisers formed a protective arc. Fraser's battleship group tightened its line. The Arctic twilight faded into complete blackness. And somewhere in that vast, freezing expanse, two forces were now on converging paths. Scharnhorst searched for a convoy. The British searched for her. Only the storm stood between them. And soon, even the storm would not be enough. Angle 1, the human angle. Life aboard in the Arctic. Arctic did not care who won the war. It punished everyone equally. For the men aboard Scharnhorst, the winter of 1943 was a relentless cycle of cold, noise, and exhaustion. Inside the ship, the temperature fluctuated wildly. Boiler rooms were suffocating. Yet just a deck above, icy drafts seeped through steel seams and froze condensation on bulkheads. Many sailors wrapped newspapers inside their coats for insulation. Gloves stiffened with frost. Voices became hoarse from breathing frigid air. Every surface, from handrails to watertight doors, stung like hot iron pressed cold against the skin. Meals were rushed, eaten standing, interrupted by drills or sudden shifts in course. Seasickness was constant in the heavy winter swell. Salt water froze on decks faster than men could clear it. Gun crews worked with numb fingers. Lookouts blinked through snow that blinded them as effectively as smoke. Across the storm-swept sea, aboard British cruisers and destroyers, conditions were scarcely better. Men chipped ice from torpedo tubes, swept frozen spray from radar housings, and warmed their hands over steaming mugs in cramped mess decks. The rolling, groaning hulls felt alive, creaking, twisting, slamming into waves hard enough to shake ladders loose from their brackets. Yet beneath the hardship lay something deeper. A quiet understanding shared by Allied and German sailors alike. They knew the Arctic was the real enemy. And they knew the battle, if it came, would be fought not only with guns and torpedoes, but with endurance, discipline. And it was this human struggle, this daily fight against a merciless sea, that shaped the men who would soon face each other in darkness. And as the weather worsened and the distances closed, their hardship set the emotional stage for the tactical dance that was about to begin. Angle 2. The tactical angle. Convoy versus raider. The Arctic convoys were not naval battleships, they were targets. Slow and vulnerable. Lines of merchantmen packed with fuel drums, ammunition crates, trucks, aircraft parts, food, and winter gear. They moved at the pace of the slowest ship, forming tight columns where one hit could force collisions or ignite chain reactions of fire. But they did not sail alone. Escorts formed a defensive shell around them, destroyers weaving in constant arcs, corvettes picking up submarine echoes, cruisers watching the horizon for larger threats. The theory behind these formations was simple: protect the heart of the convoy at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing escorts in the process. To talk to German planners, Scharnhorst's mission was clear: avoid the escorts, slip past the screening cruisers, strike the merchant column itself fast, violently, decisively. A single battleship charging through the center of a convoy could sink a dozen ships in minutes. Panic would scatter the survivors. The storm would swallow them. And the Soviet Union would feel the blow months later on the battlefield. That was the ideal scenario. But the British had rewritten the script. Instead of reacting to Scharnhorst, Admiral Fraser intended to funnel her between two forces, forcing Bay to fight on British terms. Cruisers would hold her attention. Radar would track her movements. Duke of York would close from an unexpected direction. This was not a defensive strategy. It was a trap designed for one objective: corner Scharnhorst and destroy her. The tactical logic of convoy versus raider, once so tilted in Germany's favor, was about to flip against them, revealing just how lethal a coordinated Allied screen could be. And at the center of that shift lay a revolution in naval technology. Angle 3. The technological angle. Radar in the night. For centuries, naval battles depended on visibility lookouts, signal lamps, searchlights, and daylight. But in the Arctic night of 1943, technology decided everything. British ships carried advanced centimetric radar, capable of detecting targets through snow, darkness, and sea clutter at long ranges. Cruisers like HMS Belfast could identify bearings, estimate speed, and feed precise solutions to fire control computers linked to their main guns. Duke of York's radar was so advanced that she could track Scharnhorst without ever seeing her silhouette. Germany's radar, however, lagged behind. Scharnhorst sets were older, less sensitive, and most critically mounted high and exposed. During the morning engagement with British cruisers, her forward radar was knocked out by a lucky hit, leaving her partially blind in conditions where human eyes were almost useless. From that moment on, the battle tilted sharply. British ships could aim without sight. Scharnhorst could fire, but not confidently track. In a fight occurring entirely in polar darkness, radar was not just equipment. It was dominance. It was initiative. It was the ability to strike first and strike accurately. The men in Duke of York's radar room, staring into the soft glow of screens, would soon direct 14-inch salvos across miles of black ocean. Their German counterparts, meanwhile, would be forced to rely on scattered visual sightings, incomplete bearings, and instinct. In the Battle of the North Cape, radar wasn't an advantage. It was the deciding factor, and the man who understood this most was the one commanding the trap. Angle 4. The leadership angle. Fraser versus Bay. Two admirals, two philosophies, two completely different paths to the same moment. Admiral Bruce Fraser, commander of the home fleet, was methodical and patient. He understood the vastness of the Arctic and the chaos it created. His strength lay in coordination, placing forces like chess pieces across a moving battlefield. Fraser's plan for JW-55B was not about protecting merchant ships alone. It was about ending a threat permanently. He respected Scharnhorst. He feared what she could do. And for that reason, he planned to strike her where she was weakest alone, blinded, and forced into a night battle she could not win. Rear Admiral Eric Bay, by contrast, was a destroyer man, bold, aggressive, skilled in close-range torpedo actions. But now he commanded a lone battleship in conditions that negated her speed advantage. He had no air cover, limited radar, and destroyers struggling to maintain formation in brutal seas. Bay's dilemma was stark: disobey orders and return to port, or press forward into the storm and hope to slip past British screens. He chose duty, chose momentum, chose to trust speed and surprise. But Fraser had built his trap on the assumption that Bay would do exactly that. Leadership shaped the coming battle long before guns fired through decisions, instincts, and the unseen pressure of a war turning against Germany. And these two men, steering fleets toward each other in darkness, had now set the stage for the confrontation the Arctic had been holding its breath for. Angle 5, Geography and Weather. The Arctic battlefield. The Barents Sea was a battlefield shaped not by coastlines, but by darkness, wind, and water. North Cape, the far northern tip of Norway, jutted into a frozen world where storms rolled in without warning and daylight vanished for weeks. In late December, the sun never rose above the horizon. At best, a few hours of dim, blue-gray twilight offered a hint of the world's shape before fading again into blackness. For any fleet, these conditions were a curse. For Scharnhorst, they were worse. The Arctic night erased visibility so thoroughly that even powerful searchlights became useless. Snow squalls transformed distance into emptiness. Waves climbed stories high, pounding hulls with the force of battering rams. Ice froze valves, stiffened rigging, and added tons of weight to superstructures. Guns jammed. Rangefinders fogged. Men who touched exposed metal with bare hands risked losing skin. German reconnaissance aircraft were grounded by the weather. U-boats struggled to maintain contact with convoys. Without reliable spotting, the Kriegsmarine sailed half-blind. The British, however, embraced the environment as an ally. Their radar pierced the darkness. Their cruisers, lighter and more maneuverable, handled the seas better than a battleship built for Atlantic operations. Destroyers, though battered by the storm, remained fast enough to launch torpedo attacks at close range. In this environment, the old rules of naval warfare collapsed. Speed meant less. Visibility meant nothing. And the side that could sense through the storm, rather than see through it, would dominate. The Arctic battlefield did not merely set the stage. It chose the victor. And it had chosen long before the first shells were fired. Angle 6, Naval Architecture. Scharnhorst versus Duke of York. On paper, Scharnhorst was a deadly predator. In practice, she carried design limitations that would prove fatal. Scharnhorst was fast, extraordinarily fast for a ship her size. Over 30 knots when conditions allowed. With triple 11-inch guns and strong armor. She was built for commerce raiding, hit hard, run fast. Avoid protracted battles with heavier ships. But during the North Cape mission, the environment neutralized her greatest strength. Heavy seas forced her to slow. Ice coated her bow, increasing drag. A hit early in the engagement damaged a boiler room, reducing her speed further and depriving her of the one advantage she relied upon above all else: her guns. Though rapid firing and accurate at medium ranges, lacked the punch of Duke of York's 14-inch guns. More importantly, her fire control depended partly on optical sights and forward radar, both degraded or destroyed early in the fight. HMS Duke of York, by contrast, was not the fastest ship nor the most glamorous. But she was a purpose-built fleet battleship. Heavy armor designed for ship-to-ship combat, 14-inch guns capable of crippling enemy capital ships with a few hits, advanced fire control, Radar integrated directly into her gunnery. Systems, robust machinery that handled rough seas more steadily, where Scharnhorst needed to see her enemy. Duke of York needed only to detect a bearing. Where Scharnhorst relied on maneuver, Duke of York relied on methodical tracking. And where Scharnhorst was built to raid convoys, Duke of York was built to kill raiders. The freezing night of 26 December placed both ships into their ideal or catastrophic roles. Scharnhorst became a wounded runner. Duke of York became the hunter she was engineered to be. And in the black Arctic waters, engineering began deciding fate. Angle 7, psychological and moral angle. The last big gun hunt by late 1943. Everyone involved knew a truth they rarely spoke aloud. This might be the last great battleship duel in European history. Aircraft carriers were transforming naval warfare. Submarines lurked everywhere. Radar was replacing eyesight. Airplanes were replacing armor. The age of massive steel warships battling at close-range Jutland Doggerbank. Tsushima was fading like the last daylight over North Cape. For German sailors aboard Scharnhorst, the mission carried a heavy mix of duty and dread. They knew the odds. They knew British radar was superior. They knew that engaging alone was risky. But they also knew the pride attached to their ship, one of the last operational surface raiders of the Reich. A vessel whose very name still carried weight in Allied planning rooms. For the Allies, the psychological stakes were equally high. Every sailor escorting JW-55B understood what a successful German attack would mean. Dozens of merchant ships lost. Hundreds of men drowned or frozen. Supplies to the Soviet Union delayed or destroyed. Another PQ-17. Another tragedy written into the ICC. And for Admiral Fraser, the moral equation was clear. If Scharnhorst escaped or achieved a victory, the Arctic route might again become a graveyard of steel and shattered cargo. There was no desire for spectacle. No hunger for glory. Only necessity and a quiet understanding that stopping Scharnhorst meant saving countless lives. Far from the Arctic, these psychological pressures narrowed both sides. Choices. The Germans sailed because they had no alternative. The British pursued because the world could not allow another Arctic disaster. And when both fleets finally collided, they carried more than weapons into the night. They carried the emotional weight of a naval era reaching its final violent chapter. With the angles set, the story now tightens around the moment everything converges. The first radar contact that ignites the battle itself. The first hint that the trap was beginning to close came in the faint glow of a radar screen aboard HM's Belfast. It was early on the 26th of December 1943, a day with no sunrise. The Arctic storm had only grown worse overnight. Waves hammered hulls. Snow blew in dense sheets across the decks. The convoy JW-55B, somewhere to the east, pressed onward under constant icing. And somewhere out in the blinding storm, a German battleship was searching for them. At 7:55, Belfast's radar operator saw it, a small, shifting contact on the edge of the display. The sea clutter was heavy, but the echo was too steady, too deliberate, to be a wave. He reported it. The bearing was relayed. A few seconds later, the same contact appeared on HMS Norfolk's radar. Rear Admiral Robert Burnett, commanding the cruiser screen, stiffened. There was only one possible explanation. Scharnhorst had found them. The British cruisers turned to intercept, maintaining distance. Their goal was not to fight alone. They needed to hold Scharnhorst long enough for Admiral Fraser's battleship force to arrive. Inside Scharnhorst, the mood was different. Rear Admiral Bay believed he had sighted a portion of the convoy screen. Reports suggested merchantmen could not be far. Yet the storm hid nearly everything. Lookouts strained their eyes through snow and darkness. Radar contacts flickered in and out. The German destroyers, struggling in worsening seas, had fallen behind. Unknown to Bay, this separation was already sealing Scharnhorst's fate. At 9:21. The first engagement began. HMS Belfast fired star shells, bright flares arcing across the sky, turning the night into a ghostly blue daylight. The British cruisers opened fire quickly, their shells slamming into the sea around the German battleship. Scharnhorst responded with her forward turrets, sending 11-inch salvos roaring back through the snow. But the key moment came within minutes. A single British shell struck Scharnhorst forward, damaging her SeaTac radar and knocking out a turret's power supply. Just like that. The German battleship was half-blind. In these conditions, losing radar was not a setback, it was catastrophic. Bay no longer had reliable bearings. He could no longer track British movements through the storm. His ship, built for speed and precision, was now fighting in darkness with nothing but instinct. Realizing he was outmatched, Bay turned away sharply, trying to break contact and regain maneuvering freedom. The morning battle became a brief, violent clash that ended as abruptly as it began. Within minutes, Scharnhorst disappeared into the swirling storm once more, leaving Burnett's cruisers to search the void. To British officers, this escape was expected. To Admiral Fraser waiting to the west, it was exactly what he hoped for. He knew Burnett's cruisers would push Scharnhorst southward. The storm, the geography, the convoy's position, they all funneled the German ship toward the jaws of Force 2. And Fraser, calm and patient, began closing the distance aboard HMS Duke of York. Meanwhile, Scharnhorst raced through the Barents Sea, her engines straining. Speed was Bay's only weapon. He attempted a wide sweep, hoping to circle behind the convoy. But without radar, he was guessing. His destroyers, vital for torpedo attacks and protection, had lost contact entirely. Scharnhorst was now alone. Hours passed. The storm did not break. Wind screamed across the decks, freezing spray to armor plates. Shortly before noon, Burnett's cruisers found Scharnhorst again. Another radar contact, another flash of star shells, another exchange of fire across shadowed waves. Again, Scharnhorst fled south, relying on raw speed. Again, she slipped into the storm. But each escape drove her closer to Fraser. By mid-afternoon, Bay realized the truth. He was not finding the convoy. The convoy was never the objective. He was being herded. Yet turning back was impossible. The seas behind him were full of British warships. Turning east would take him toward the convoy's escorts. And turning south toward safety meant sailing straight into the unknown. So he pressed forward. Ahead lay darkness, but also the faint hope that he could outrun whatever waited for him. As daylight faded into the Arctic twilight, Duke of York's radar operators began scanning the storm. The ship's bridge was dim, lit only by red lamps and the faint glow of plotting tables. At 16:17, the room fell silent. A radar operator called out a steady echo. Bearing 315, range, roughly 21,000 yards, strong, clear, moving. Admiral Fraser leaned in. There was no doubt. Scharnhorst at the British battleship altered course. Her guns trained automatically toward the unseen target. In the icy dark, her crew prepared for action, shells hoisted, propellant charges stacked, turrets locked into firing arcs. Duke of York closed the distance, guided by radar like a hunter stalking prey in a blizzard. On Scharnhorst, no one yet sensed the danger. Her radar was still down. Her lookout saw only snow and wind. Her bridge knew only that the cruisers were gone. She was running blind straight into a battleship she could not see. And as Duke of York crept into position for the opening salvo, the Arctic night grew strangely quiet, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. The trap had finally closed. In the darkness of the Barents Sea, HMS Duke of York had become a silent predator. Scharnhorst, unaware, steamed directly into her path. At 16:32, Admiral Fraser gave the order that ended any remaining suspense. Open fire. A split second later, the Arctic night exploded. Duke of York's forward turret unleashed a blinding flash, followed instantly by the thunder of 14-inch guns rolling across the sea like an earthquake. The blast lit the snow-filled air and silhouetted the battleship in a halo of orange light. On the plotting table, the radar trace confirmed it. The shells were on target. 20 seconds later, the first salvo struck Scharnhorst. A massive plume of fire erupted on her port side. A 14-inch shell smashed into her boiler room, ripping through machinery, killing or maiming the men inside, and most critically robbing her of precious speed. She began to slow, not much. At first, barely a knot. But in this kind of battle, a single knot could mean life or death. Scharnhorst swung hard to starboard, attempting to flee into the storm. Her engines roared, turbines strained. Propellers churned black water to foam. She returned fire, her 11-inch guns blazing defiantly into the darkness. But her salvos landed wide, sometimes miles off target, fired at a ghost she could not see. Inside Duke of York, the gunnery teams worked with calm precision. Radar fed corrections directly into fire control. Every few minutes, more shells slammed into the German battleship. Smoke poured from her funnels. Fires flickered along her deck. Yet she kept running. Scharnhorst was wounded, but she was not beaten. Not yet. Her crew, disciplined and courageous, fought to keep her alive. But Fraser had no intention of letting her escape. He ordered his destroyers in. The destroyer A.T. Take, from the east, west and north, the British and Norwegian destroyers closed in, weaving through towering waves. Snow battered their bridges. Ice clung to their rails. But they pushed forward. This was their moment. H.M. Saumarez, Savage, Scorpion, and the Norwegian destroyer Stord raced toward Scharnhorst's predicted track. Torpedo tubes were cleared. Bearings calculated. Engines throbbed under maximum strain. Stord was first. Through the blizzard, her silhouette burst out of the dark like a predator. At less than 2,000 yards, a suicidal range, she launched a spread of torpedoes and veered away, her captain shouting orders over the roar of the sea. Seconds later, columns of water erupted along Scharnhorst's hull. Torpedo hits. Her speed dropped again. Then the British destroyers surged in. Savage released torpedoes. Scorpion launched her own spread. Saumarez followed through fire and sleet. More detonations slammed into Scharnhorst's sides. Her speed bled away, falling steadily toward 10 knots. Fires raged uncontrolled. Her turbines groaned as metal warped from heat and shock. The battleship that once outran pursuers now limped through the night like a wounded animal. Duke of York closed in for the kill. The final GUN FIGHT at 1850. Belfast and Jamaica re-entered the battle, firing star shells that turned the stormy night into an eerie blue-white battlefield. For the first time, British lookouts could clearly see Scharnhorst glowing faintly through the snow, fires licking across her deck, her wake foaming erratically behind her. Duke of York renewed her bombardment. Shell after shell found its mark. One hit destroyed turret Anton, another ruptured her deck armor. A third tore into her superstructure, igniting ammunition stores. Yet Scharnhorst's guns kept firing slower. Weaker, but with a defiance that impressed even her enemies. Her crew refused to abandon their posts. They fought a ship that was dying beneath their feet. Admiral Fraser now had the advantage he needed. He ordered a final torpedo. Strike this time from the cruisers and trailing destroyers. Belfast and Jamaica launched spreads. Opportune and Virago moved in close. Matchless and Musketeer swept around her stern. 20 torpedoes, then 30. Then 40. The sea around Scharnhorst erupted in towering geysers of fire and water. Hit after hit tore open her hull. Her engines stopped. Her lights failed. Her guns fell silent. For a moment, in the chaos, she drifted, black, broken, defiant. Then she rolled sharply to starboard. The end had come. The last moments at 1945. Scharnhorst capsized. Her keel rose briefly out of the water like the spine of a dying beast. A deep rumble tore through the night as internal explosions ripped her apart. Then the Barents Sea swallowed her whole. The roar of battle faded. The sea turned quiet. Only oil debris and freezing men struggling in the water remained. British destroyers risked their own safety to rescue survivors. They threw nets, ropes, life belts, anything that might cling to a man half frozen in the Arctic dark. Out of nearly 1,968 German sailors, only 36 were pulled from the sea. For minutes, the rescuers searched. Then the cold forced them to stop. Scharnhorst was gone. The last major German surface raider had fallen, and the Arctic night closed over her grave. The battle was over. The consequences were only beginning. The echoes of gunfire faded quickly across the Barents Sea, swallowed by wind and darkness. What remained was a field of drifting wreckage, splintered wood, twisted steel, and men struggling in waters cold enough to kill within minutes. The battle had lasted hours. The end took only seconds. British destroyers moved cautiously through the debris field, their searchlights sweeping across the black water. What they found was haunting. Scharnhorst, proud, fast, feared, had vanished entirely. No great hull. No burning superstructure. Only oil slicks and fragments marked where she had gone down. Scorpion was among the first to begin rescue operations. Her crew leaned over the rails, reaching for any survivor who still had the strength to raise an arm. But most men in the water were silent, drifting, already overcome by the cold. Those still alive clung desperately to floating wreckage, their faces gray, their limbs stiffening. Some could not let go, even after death. Their hands had frozen to the planks they held. On HMS Matchless, sailors formed human chains along the deck to pull men aboard. The officers knew the risk stopping in such conditions exposed the destroyers to capsizing from ice, buildup, and rogue waves, but the crews insisted. No one wished to leave a fellow seaman to die, even an enemy. The rescued German sailors were barely conscious. Their clothes were sheets of ice. Many couldn't speak. Some muttered the same word over and over through numb lips. Cult, cult. Cold. As medical teams wrapped them in blankets, British sailors noted the shock etched across their faces. These were men who had moments earlier served aboard a capital ship. Now they had watched their world vanish beneath the waves in a roar of metal and darkness. Aboard HMS Saumarez, damage control teams worked desperately to contain the fires and flooding caused during the attack run. One torpedo explosion had blown open her side plates, killing several crewmen. She limped through the storm, deck slick with freezing water and fuel oil, barely able to maintain speed. Yet even she sent crewmen to assist in recovery. In total, only 36 survivors were found. Every rescue attempt afterward recovered only bodies. The sea had taken the rest. On HMS Duke of York, Admiral Fraser received the casualty reports in silence. He had commanded battles in distant seas, overseen raids and patrols, but this victory carried a weight he did not hide. After confirming that no more survivors could be located, Fraser dictated a message to the Admiralty, a message that has since become one of the most famous dispatches of the war. Scharnhorst has been sunk. Please convey to the commanding officer of Stord my highest admiration for the skill and daring displayed in his torpedo attack. It was a rare, personal commendation. The Norwegian destroyer Stord had pressed so close to Scharnhorst that some British officers later claimed the distance was so small one could almost throw a stone aboard her. Fraser wanted that courage recognized. Another message followed, this time addressing the German sailors who had perished. She fought gallantly and went down with her flag flying. Even in victory, Fraser showed respect for the men who had stood at their post to the end. Many British sailors echoed this sentiment. Reports from Belfast and Jamaica describe crewmen standing in quiet reflection as the full scale of the loss became clear. The Arctic was a hard teacher. It demanded humility from all who sailed it. On the German side, the news spread slowly through northern Norway. The Kriegsmarine headquarters at Narvik received incomplete signals. U-boats assigned to shadow the convoy reported hearing the distant rumble of heavy gunfire. But confirmation came only when shattered wreckage washed ashore days later. Germany had lost more than a ship. She had lost her last operational battlecruiser, her last major surface threat in the Arctic, and nearly 2,000 trained sailors died for the families of the crew, most living in a Germany already battered by Allied bombing. The loss of Scharnhorst was another blow in a winter filled with grief. In the Barents Sea, as the wind howled and the night deepened, the British rescue ships turned away. Their decks were coated in ice. Their engines strained towards safer waters. The convoy they protected continued east, unaware of how close danger had come and how decisively it had been defeated. The battle was over. But the ripple effects of Scharnhorst's destruction were only beginning to shape the strategic landscape of the Arctic War. The sinking of Scharnhorst did more than end a single battle. It reshaped the strategic balance of the entire Northern War. When dawn broke on the 27th of December 1943, the Barents Sea lay quiet. The storm still raged, but the threat that had haunted Arctic convoys for 3 years had vanished into the deep. For the Allies, it felt as though a weight had been lifted from an entire ocean. Convoy JW-55B, the bait in Fraser's trap, reached Soviet waters without losing a single ship. To the exhausted merchant cruisemen who had spent days staring into snow and darkness, aware that somewhere a German battleship was hunting them, the knowledge of Scharnhorst's destruction brought a sense of relief so deep it bordered on disbelief. There would be no repeat of PQ-17, no sudden radio message ordering them to scatter, no long night waiting for guns that never came. With Scharnhorst gone and Tirpitz crippled months earlier by British meat submarines, the German Navy no longer possessed a surface ship capable of challenging the Arctic convoys. The most dangerous chapter of northern shipping had closed in a single night. For the Soviet Union, this mattered greatly. The supplies that arrived in Murmansk and Archangel tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition fed the armies pushing west into Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic. Each convoy delivered steel that turned into momentum on the battlefield. Scharnhorst's destruction ensured that the crucial winter deliveries of 1943-44 reached their destination. Soviet reports later noted that these shipments helped strengthen forces preparing for the massive offensives of the coming year. In the Admiralty in London, the victory was analyzed with meticulous care. The conclusions were clear. Radar had been decisive. Coordination between cruiser screens and heavy units worked flawlessly. Destroyers, when used aggressively, could cripple even a battleship. This battle confirmed lessons learned in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and against Bismarck. The age of relying solely on optics and daylight was over. Naval warfare had entered a new era, one in which detection and information mattered as much as armor and gun caliber. The loss of Scharnhorst also forced Germany to reconsider its naval strategy. Grand Admiral Dönitz, who had once commanded U-boats with ruthless efficiency, now faced an unavoidable truth. Surface ships without air cover and without superior radar were liabilities, not assets. The remaining heavy unit, Tirpitz, stayed bottled up in Norwegian fjords until British bombers finished her in 1944. From that point forward, Germany's navy became almost entirely a submarine force. In Norway, the mood in German naval bases grew somber. The Kriegsmarine lowered flags to half-mast. Officers read the casualty lists in silence. Many had served with Scharnhorst during earlier campaigns, her Atlantic sorties, her dramatic escape through the English Channel, her battles off Norway. She had been more than a warship. She had been a symbol of resilience, one of the last gleaming remnants of a once proud surface fleet. To lose her in a single night felt like losing an entire chapter of naval identity. Among the Allies, the triumph was tempered by respect. Reports circulated of British crews speaking quietly about the courage of Scharnhorst's men, how they kept firing until their ship rolled over, how they stayed at their posts despite fires, flooding, and failing machinery. The Arctic, indifferent and merciless, had swallowed friend and foe alike. In this respect, the battle left behind not triumphalism, but humility. In Parliament, the First Lord of the Admiralty praised Fraser's leadership and the crew's discipline, calling the action a shining example of coordination and skill under the most brutal conditions imaginable. Newspapers across Britain and the Commonwealth ran headlines celebrating the victory. Yet many also carried columns mourning the nearly 2,000 German sailors who died far from home, and in the frozen waters north of Norway, the sea kept its silence. Duke of York steamed south. The cruisers resumed their escort duties. The destroyers, battered and ice-covered, reported to repair yards. Behind them, in the black depths, Scharnhorst settled into her final resting place, engines cold, guns frozen in place. Her hull entombed under layers of Arctic silt. Her sinking marked the end of Germany's surface threat in the north. It marked the triumph of radar over sight, of coordination over speed, of endurance over bravado. And it marked the moment when the Arctic route, one of the harshest supply lines in history, finally belonged to the Allies. Now only one task remained: to understand what this battle truly meant. In the stillness that followed the Battle of the North Cape, a truth settled over the frozen sea, quiet, heavy, undeniable. What happened on the 26th of December 1943 was more than the destruction of a warship. It was the end of an era. For decades, the battleship had been the symbol of naval power. Nations measured pride in inches of armor and the weight of steel broadsides. Scharnhorst herself had been born into that world, fast, elegant, deadly, built to strike fear into convoys and coastlines alike. Yet in her final hours, she met an enemy she could not outrun, a new kind of warfare shaped not by eyesight or speed, but by electrons, detection, and coordination. Radar did not shout. It did not roar like guns or crash like waves. It whispered across the void, seeing through snow and darkness, guiding shells with mathematical calm. And in that whisper lay the fate of Scharnhorst. Her end marked the moment when the balance of naval power shifted decisively. The ocean was no longer ruled by the ship that could see farthest or run fastest, but by the fleet that could sense, communicate, and act as one. The Arctic night, once the great equalizer, no longer served the boldest ship, it served the most prepared. Yet beyond the strategy and technology, something deeper remained. Nearly 2,000 men died in that battle. Sailors who chipped ice from decks, who loaded shells with frozen hands, who stood at their posts until the sea claimed them. Their courage does not fade with the passing of decades. It survives in the quiet respect spoken by those who fought against them, and in the solemn silence of the Arctic waters where they rest. Today, the Barents Sea is calm. The storms come and go, indifferent to history. Beneath them lies the wreck of Scharnhorst, her guns cold, her flags long gone, her steel a monument to the last great duel of battleships in European waters. The world that sent her to sea has vanished. But the lesson remains: in war, technology changes. Courage does not. And in the frozen darkness of the North Cape, both were tested to their limits, leaving behind a story of endurance, innovation, and the final echo of an age now gone.